Can someone of goodwill go outside, take a whip, and bring everybody here? We'll wait 5 minutes, okay? But in the meantime,
Sergio isn't here yet either.
you know, who?
Sergio.
Duarte? Yes.
He's,
No, he will arrive.
yeah, so we should wait for him.
Sure, sure. No, but no, that sound. I think is no. Paul? Voi siete puntuali. La riprova che gli italiani sono i migliori di tutti. Infatti. I think Sergio has had a very dreadful night. In fact, a non-existing night. So he's really a hero of our meeting. Yusuf, can you give us a help in collecting everybody outside, and then go to the restaurant room and. Okay, good. Secondo me è meglio dal tavolo, te lo dico, gli uomini venire appoggi. Ma non lo so. Ok. Can everybody come and sit faster than the speed of light? Good. Okay. Have a seat and don't sleep. Do you know what Saddam Hussein did to a general who was found asleep while he was talking? He killed him. And we are trying to practice the same policy. Okay? My friend generals, sit. Okay. We had 15 minutes delay in finishing the first round, so that's fair enough that we have 15 minute delay here. So that's okay. Yeah, the elevators, since people are lazy, don't take the stairs. Yeah, no, I cannot do that. I don't have working legs, so. Okay. Why are you sitting on top over there? You can sit down. No need to go up. It's cooler? Ah, that's I didn't know. I will check now. Okay. I'm sitting here just to remind you that you have to see. I'm not sitting, I'm standing. Okay. Have a seat, have a seat, have a seat. I think I finished my role. I leave you I leave you the floor to serious people. Jennifer? Jennifer? I leave the floor to serious people. I'm finished. I leave the floor to serious people.
Are you going to say my name or should
No, I can do that, but you have a chair there. Oh, the chair is Sergio Duarte, so I can do that since that you are part or not. Yeah, wait. I can do this. Okay. Oh. There's people still entering, so we. Yeah. But there is a lot of people coming now, so we don't want to disappoint them. Yeah, you're right. You're not part of the panel. You're before the panel. Okay, so we start now, I can do that, with the Simon Symposium. And let me explain briefly what is the Simon Symposium. And here you have Jennifer Simons, and the connection between the two names is not casual. It's through something. We had, since some years, some time, we had the first part of the main topic, of the main conference, to devote it to the Simons Foundation, which is kindly helping this conference to go ahead since a few years. And the Simon Symposium is a symposium where we don't have a working group. We have just plenary speeches, and the main topic has to do with the nuclear issues. And we have today some important nuclear issue that we are going to discuss. The first one is the situation. The nuclear ban treaty at the UN that will be introduced by Sergio Duarte and chaired by him. Then we will have a plenary on the WND-free zone in the Middle East, which is a recurrent theme which has been discussed since many years, and very appropriately President Jayanta Dhanapala, who was chaired in 1995 a review and extension conference of the NPT that dealt with, I guess for the first time, don't do any mistakes, but dealt with the first time with the issue of nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East that later become the WND-free zone in the Middle East. And then we had a panel about nuclear risks, and we invited the representative of the, so to say, non-official nuclear countries, namely the countries that are not recognized as such by the NPT. And these are Israel, India, and Pakistan. North Korea is not here. They are preparing their own missiles, so they have no time to come here. So, having said that, I think it's a pleasure to me to give the floor to Jennifer Simons that will introduce, sitting there or here. You want? Okay, she likes to be here, so I go out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate very much the opportunity to introduce the 5th Simons Symposium on Nuclear Disarmament, and I'd like to add my welcome to those who've come before me and congratulate the organizers of the 62nd Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs. And I'd like to particularly thank Chairman Kassym-Jomart Tokayev and the Senate of the Parliament of Kazakhstan and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their contributions and support of the Pugwash Conference. This is my first visit to Kazakhstan, but in the spring of 1991, when in Canada we learned of Kazakhstan's decision to close the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, I traveled to Moscow with a Canadian delegation to encourage the Soviet Union to reconsider its plan to ship the testing to an unstable island of Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic, an issue of great concern to Canada, and to end all testing. Since then, Kazakhstan has become an independent country, returned its nuclear weapons to Russia, rid the country of more than 0.5 ton of highly enriched uranium, secured its nuclear facilities, and become a global leader in nuclear disarmament. But Kazakhstan has paid an enormous catastrophic price for its disastrous experience as a Soviet testing site for nuclear weapons, and I extend my sympathy for the hundreds of thousands of Kazakh citizens who have died, and to those still alive who suffer from the devastating effects of the nuclear tests, and to the future generations who, because of the altered genetic code, will continue to be subjected to these heartbreaking consequences. And I applaud President Nazarbayev for his vision, for the wisdom of his decision to reject the standing of a nuclear power, and instead for his country to become a global leader in nuclear disarmament, to eliminate, working tirelessly to encourage other countries to eliminate their weapons, and engaging in numerous other actions focused on a nuclear weapon-free world. President Nazarbayev himself deserves his recently announced prize because of Kazakhstan's major contribution to nuclear disarmament and global security. Another leader in nuclear disarmament is my good friend and colleague, Jayantha Dhanapala, who is responsible for the establishment of the Simons Symposium on Nuclear Disarmament at Pugwash conferences. And I want to express my regret, Jayantha, that your 10-year term as president of Pugwash conferences has come to an end. As chair of the 1995 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Review Conference, Jayantha Dhanapala masterfully secured the conference's success in the adoption of the indefinite extension of the treaty, in which the nuclear weapons states reaffirm their commitment, and to quote from the treaty, to pursue in good faith negotiations on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament, the fulfillment of which required, again I quote, the determined pursuit by nuclear weapon states of systematic and progressive efforts to reduce nuclear weapons globally, with the ultimate goal of eliminating these weapons. I first met Jayantha Dhanapala when he was the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs. In that position, he was an exceedingly forceful proponent of the third pillar of the NPT, the fulfillment by the nuclear weapon states to eliminate their arsenals. I was impressed by his strong principled stand against the nuclear weapon states concept and still current pursuit of managed and controlled proliferation, its failure manifested in the acquisition of nuclear weapons by India, Pakistan, and Israel, in the covert programs of Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and in the current threat posed by North Korea. As a former US ambassador said at a recent conference, we have never succeeded in stopping a nuclear aspirant country. Jayantha, please accept my deep appreciation and thanks for all you have done, and I'm sure will continue to do. I do hope that you carry on as a potent voice for nuclear disarmament, because your strong words of criticism and your principled stand against managed and controlled proliferation, in that you express the truth, the root cause of the dangerous situation in which we find ourselves today. The symposium topic, Prospects for Nuclear Disarmament, comes at a time when the situation does not look at all promising. As the Global Zero Nuclear Crisis Group points out, the risks of a nuclear exchange or a nuclear war are unacceptably high, with current potential catastrophic flashpoints between India and Pakistan, the United States and Russia, NATO and Russia, and in the Korean Peninsula, which is causing us so much anxiety, even fear today. It is very clear that the nuclear weapon states have no intention of disarming. On the contrary, they have repudiated the nuclear weapons ban treaty, with the United States, France, and the United Kingdom issuing a joint statement denouncing the treaty, and I quote, "We do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to it." Every nuclear weapon state is modernizing, creating new capabilities for its arsenals, and financially planning for their retention far into the future. As well, every nuclear weapon state in Asia is building up its arsenal. So the question becomes, what will it take for them to eliminate their nuclear weapons? And it's becoming increasingly clear that it will probably take a nuclear detonation or a nuclear war with its catastrophic consequences for them to disarm and destroy their weapons, that is, if they're still around. The current greatest danger is the acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, because it will reward withdrawal from the NPT and encourage the other nuclear-allowed, nuclear-capable states in further proliferation. Most importantly, it entrenches failed policy and practice and jeopardizes the safety and security of the world. It is imperative that North Korea end its nuclear and missile tests and denuclearize. The global community must not accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, not even as a member of the non-NPT outlier club, Israel, whose weapons were probably an incentive for the programs in Iraq, Iran, and Libya. India and Pakistan, their weak command control systems, the vulnerability to human error, system malfunction, and cyber and terrorist attacks pose an immense danger to the world community. So to encourage North Korea to denuclearize, and in an endeavor to prevent both President Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un from blundering into war, I call upon President Nazarbayev and the government of Kazakhstan to host and to lead a renewal of the former six-party talks. As a precedent is Kazakhstan's immense contribution to the success of the Iran nuclear negotiations. Kazakhstan and North Korea already share a connection. Kazakhstan was deeply engaged in the negotiations for the Nuclear Weapons Bans Treaty, and it is noteworthy that North Korea was the only state with nuclear weapons to vote in favor of negotiating this treaty. Kazakhstan is a model which North Korea would do well to follow. The goals of Kazakhstan and North Korea are similar: economic growth, investment, trade, international recognition, and security. The chosen paths, though, are completely different, with Kazakhstan choosing to be rid of its nuclear weapons and to be a responsible and respected member of the world community. Mr. Kim, on the other hand, believes that North Korea can only be secure enough to focus on economic growth if North Korea has a nuclear deterrent, and is said to be modeling itself on China's path to the P5, the simultaneous pursuit of nuclear weapons and economic development. And Kazakhstan's economy, as we see outside, has benefited substantially over the past decade, and as a nuclear-free member of good standing in the global community with a strong and growing economy, Kazakhstan can demonstrate to North Korea that its nuclear and missile tests act against its own interest because of the consequent multilateral economic sanctions and pariah status. But North Korea is not the only current impediment to nuclear disarmament. The world has undergone a huge tectonic shift of changing demographics, mass migration, the consequences of war and climate change, runaway capitalism creating extremes of poverty and wealth, the extraordinary rise of information technology affecting employment and livelihoods and weaponized for disinformation warfare. A potent combination giving rise to right-wing extremism, to xenophobia, to nationalism, unilateralism, and to an angry electorate desperate for change who in the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and in the United States elected Donald Trump as president. And as a consequence, we are facing a kaleidoscope of changing alliances: the decline of the United States as a world leader, the emergence of China as a superpower, a resurgent and aggressive Russia, the loss of United Kingdom as a member of the European Union, illiberal democracies in NATO countries of Poland, Hungary, and Turkey. So what does this mean for nuclear disarmament? Because since 1946, the United States has been responsible for the majority of nuclear disarmament initiatives, although not always taking the last step. But President Trump, with his isolationist stance, his repudiation of alliances and treaties, is making it clear that the United States is loath to take or has lost its former leadership role in the world. And the United States under President Trump is considered by former CIA and National Security Agency Director General Michael Hayden as the most disruptive force in the world today. The United States is considered to no longer to be a trusted partner in international alliances, and world leaders, including allies and defense allies, are re-evaluating their relationships with the United States. And unease and lack of trust in President Trump is provoking calls in South Korea and Japan for their own nuclear weapons. His reluctant affirmation of Article 5 has created uncertainty among NATO partners about the reliance of American security assurances, which President Trump has called into question. And this creates a potential fracture of the NATO alliance. The uncertainty of President Trump's intentions, a resurgent, aggressive Russia, and the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union has strengthened the resolve of the European Union to establish its own defense alliance with perhaps France as the only European nuclear power. And rather than take the opportunity to rid itself of US tactical nuclear weapons on its soil and Russian tactical weapons at its borders, and requesting the US and Russia to remove them to storage bases in home countries as advocated by Global Zero, Germany sought and has received legal advice that it could finance the British or French nuclear weapons programs in exchange for their protection, or could legally base nuclear warheads on German soil. It ascertained also that the European Union could do the same if it changed its budgeting rules, and this would surely weaken the NATO alliance, at least with regard to its nuclear weapons policy. Another potential NATO fracture comes from Turkey, which signed an agreement with Russia to buy a long-range air and missile defense system, a system not compatible with current NATO missile defense systems. And moreover, Turkey refused to allow German lawmakers to visit troops at Turkey's main NATO base, and Germany, as a consequence, has withdrawn its troops from Turkey. The predominant destabilizing force in relations between Russia and the United States and NATO is the US missile defense system, which has its roots in the United States' 2002 withdrawal from the US-Russian bilateral ABM treaty. The US withdrawal has said to be the cause of Russia's development and deployment of a ground-launched cruise missile, a violation of the INF treaty. The United States, rather than stand down or eliminate its missile defense, has plans to escalate weapon buildup and counter with its own road-mobile ground-launched cruise missile. And the great spiral of weaponry continues, out of control, and at enormous potential human, social, and economic cost. The immediate future is bleak for nuclear disarmament. The brightest star on the horizon is possibly the election in the UK within the next 6 months, which a weakened Theresa May lose. A newly elected Labour government with Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister would, he says, be committed to remove nuclear weapons from the world. And if he follows through, this would in all likelihood destroy the US, France, UK trio, and perhaps motivate China and Russia, and maybe even India, to begin the disarmament process. It would also mean a radical change to NATO's nuclear weapons policy. Another light on the horizon is the nuclear weapons ban treaty. This is a necessary and long overdue first step to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Because the NPT was deliberately created to be vague on the issue of elimination, the ban treaty is an essential and welcome complement to the NPT. The major problem with the treaty is that it does not eliminate existing arsenals, nor does it eliminate or reduce the dangers that nuclear weapons pose today. It also lacks verification and transparency measures, but it does have provisions for nuclear weapon states to join with mandated terms for the time-bound verified elimination of their weapons and programs. I'm hopeful that NATO member states which host nuclear weapons will be subjected to domestic pressure from civil society to sign the treaty. This would not undermine NATO, but rather the NATO nuclear weapons policy. We cannot count on the dangerously volatile Trump administration to further nuclear disarmament. With changing political and defense alliances, can we look for nuclear disarmament leadership from China and Russia? Though to date nothing has occurred, China and Russia have taken a leadership role in the North Korea-US standoff with a joint proposal to bring the United States and North Korea to the table and to set the terms of negotiations. And Russia's President Putin, who rejected Obama's 2013 Berlin challenge to negotiate bilateral cuts of their arsenals to 1,000, has turned the tables, and in a phone call to President Trump, initiated talks with the United States on a range of disputes and proposed extending the 2010 New START treaty. But this was summarily rejected by the US President. However, every encouragement should be given to the US administration to ensure these discussions take place in order to diffuse the tensions and return Russia and the United States to resume bilateral cuts of their nuclear weapons so that multilateral negotiations can begin. As you see, I'm not very optimistic. As President Nazarbayev says so rightly, the path to release the planet from the threat of nuclear suicide is not easy. It requires profound mental changes, new multilateral political decisions, and a high level of trust in international relations. And it's essential that we achieve this goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Simons, for your very penetrating analysis of the current situation regarding nuclear weapons. We'll start now the panel discussion about the ban treaty, the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which, as we know, was adopted last July 7 at New York. This was a major accomplishment by the international community and civil society, and it makes clear that the threat of use and the use of these weapons is unacceptable to mankind as a whole. It is always useful to recall that the goal of nuclear disarmament is as old as the United Nations itself. The first resolution of the General Assembly in 1946 set as a goal the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction. Chemical and bacteriological weapons are outlawed already, and now we have successfully negotiated a treaty banning nuclear weapons. Once 50 states ratify the treaty, these weapons will be prohibited under international law for the first time in history. The treaty clearly imposes obligations on the states that become a party to it, but a case can be made under present customary international law, emerging global humanitarian law, and abiding natural law that the prohibitions contained in the NPT are binding universally, independent of whether a state chooses or not to become a party. The position taken by the nuclear weapon powers about the NPT leaves no doubt that the parties to the treaty will have to carry on the fight to achieve universality with the invaluable support of civil society organizations. This seems a tall order indeed. I could paraphrase the reaction of a high official from a nuclear weapon state who said, said something like that, but I'm paraphrasing it. Is there anyone who really believes that any of the current possessors would agree to a ban on nuclear weapons? After 71 years of seeming accomplishments, followed by hard setbacks, the supporters of the treaty are under no illusions. The treaty will not eliminate nuclear weapons overnight. Instead, it proposes a clear path, the repudiation of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, to be followed by a negotiating process toward nuclear disarmament. The challenge now is to identify and then take the next steps, and the discussion in this panel will help us to chart the course. We have 5 very distinguished speakers, starting by Ambassador Elaine Whyte Gómez from Costa Rica, who, as we know, presided over the negotiation of the treaty. Then we have Madame Christine Muttonen from the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE. We have Ambassador Carlo Trezza, whom I have known for many years, former ambassador of Italy for disarmament and non-proliferation. We have Mr. Blair, whom very well known in this issue of disarmament and non-proliferation, from the Progress of Science and Global Security at Princeton University. And last but not least, we have Mr. Alimzhan Akhmetov from the Center for Non-Proliferation, Security and Policy in Astana, Kazakhstan. I'll give the floor to these, our speakers in the order that I mentioned them. Ambassador Whyte Gómez, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Let me thank the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs and the Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs for this invitation to share in this panel and with all of you some thoughts about the recently concluded process that adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on July the 7th in New York. Allow me to start with some personal notes, if you allow me. Ambassador Trezza was asking me about my participation in different humanitarian conferences. And it is something that some scholars have already mentioned to me that they are going to study very carefully, because I have not been engaged in nuclear disarmament throughout my career, but in other fields of multilateral diplomacy. So some scholars have suggested that they were going to very carefully study how this contributed or not to the success of the negotiations that delegations and in the middle of the process of the negotiation, the chair did not have a baggage to resort to. But I have to say that for me personally, and of course for my country, for Costa Rica, it was a true privilege to collaborate in facilitating this institutional mandate. And this is the approach that we followed. For us, we were facilitating a process, a political process that was born of an institutional mandate by the United Nations General Assembly. And this was the main focus or the main approach in the negotiations. For us, then, it was very important to be able to contribute in this case to facilitate this mandate that the United Nations had adopted to address one of the most important challenges that humanity has faced for over 7 decades. And we also strongly believe that for the international community that came out of the year 2015, with the strength of having achieved agreements on climate change and sustainable development, it was vital that the issue of nuclear weapons would not be left out of these great political processes that of courageous and visionary agreements that addressed core problems of humanity through multilateral negotiation processes. It also, of course, was very natural that the growing strength of the process of the humanitarian impact was heading towards building a concrete achievement with the negotiation mandate. Then the approval of the negotiation mandate in December 2016 by the General Assembly, Resolution 71-58, was the opportunity to bring about a qualitative and profound innovation in the way that we approach, discuss, and take action on nuclear weapons. Certainly, as we all know, one of the main risks facing humanity as a whole. But as I say, it is also fundamental that that humanity saw also the institutional framework of the United Nations taking action on one of the main challenges that we have, and that we're not putting it aside or leaving it, postponing it for another generation. The mandate of the conference was very straightforward. It was our vision. It was to negotiate a prohibition instrument that would strengthen and complement the current architecture, that would be inclusive, that would respond to the sense of urgency that the international situation demanded, that it should be concluded as soon as possible, and this is very important, it was very important in the negotiation process. The mandate made clear the distinction between the process of negotiating a prohibition norm and the future steps towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, and I believe that this aspect is central to the post-conference narrative and discussion and analysis and exchange between the different players and groups of countries, because the resolution reflected the reality that nuclear disarmament, like any other social reality, has many dimensions that interact with each other: institutional, political, legal, normative, geopolitical, scientific, practical dimensions. So this process was never intended to address, as was the case, for instance, of some other initiatives, like the ones that Costa Rica had promoted in the past of comprehensive conventions, to altogether deal with prohibition and elimination in this same process. So I just would like to recall that the mandate did express that, or did recognize that the legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons would be an important contribution towards comprehensive nuclear disarmament, but that additional measures, both practical and legally binding, were needed for the irreversible, verifiable, and transparent destruction of nuclear weapons in order to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. This means the mandate was focused on the normative and legal dimensions of the prohibition, but of course we had a very important challenge, which was the second part of the sentence in the mandate of the resolution, which was that this legally binding instrument at the same time had to lead towards, or to build a bridge towards the future elimination of nuclear weapons. The process itself, we already know that it is true that it was for several decades that the United Nations did not approve a legal instrument on nuclear disarmament, and that it is true that the treaty was negotiated in record time, that negotiations set new methodological standards that promote the interaction between official delegations, civil society in general, which include victims, activists, scientists, and scholars of different disciplines. And I am very pleased about this achievement, among other things, because it created the appropriate atmosphere and the strength of the negotiations to conclude successfully. The negotiations benefited from the fact that the conference was able to address all procedural matters on day one, which was another record time, leaving the delegations with no option but to focus on the substantive discussion. We also have to recognize that the whole exercise had been properly defined, which allowed for a first and short session that allowed delegations to exchange, not to focus on negotiating a text already, but to exchange their aspirations as to the content of the treaty. Of course, that promoted open and free discussion at the same time that the process of building the successive versions of the legal instrument also departed from the already identification of the main areas of convergence. But overall, and this deals with some of the issues that have been raised here, the conference was able to conclude successfully because of this very deep conviction and the feeling of ethical and moral imperative on the part of the delegations, and their very strong political determination. And these had been gradually shaped over the years. And of course, they took a special force with the process that we know as the humanitarian impact and the Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna conference. They had brought about new thinking, leadership, doctrine, and political articulation, strategizing, and growing force in a multi-actor process. The result then is a successful outcome for the conference and a good arrival point for the process of the humanitarian impact. But at the same time, and I want to highlight this again, it is very important that the multilateral institutional framework can show that we have the possibility to arrive at agreements and to build agreements through the instruments that are at our hands. As we are in this transition process between the negotiation, the successful negotiation, and the actual signing of the instrument, which will take us to the next phase of the development of the regime, I focus my remarks on highlighting several aspects. First of the process, just sharing some ideas of, that I think are fundamental in having shaped the way towards the successful adoption on July the 7th, and also highlighting some dimensions of the treaty that I think are the most relevant to the discussion for the next phases. First of all, I would like to highlight the issue of the establishment of a strong, comprehensive prohibition. Second, the establishment of a pathway that responded to the overwhelming political will of the conference to allow nuclear states to become state parties from day one and to undertake their disarmament efforts bound by the treaty provisions. Three, the fact that it complements and strengthens the rest of the architecture and strengthens the already existing norms of non-proliferation and prohibition of nuclear testing. It establishes an institutional design that is appropriate for the decision-making process in the future, for the development of the regime, such as the adoption, for instance, or the development or discussion of the need for a secretariat and the possibility to negotiate and sign additional legal measures that could take the form of additional protocols. And very important as well, the decision, identification or creation of an international competent authority that will take the functions and many of the functions of verification. They were already mentioned. Overall, it is also very important that the conference had a realistic approach that understood that some aspects of the elimination of nuclear arsenals were difficult to negotiate given the time frame and the absence of the nuclear weapon states. As we are running out of time, I would mention only from Article 1, from the establishment of a strong comprehensive provision, the issue that having included at the very last stage of the negotiation process the threat to use nuclear weapons in the core prohibitions of Article 1 would advance the norm against nuclear deterrence policies and practices which are based on the threat and planned use of nuclear weapons. Strengthens, of course, the non-proliferation norm and develops an effective measure under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it was the very strong belief from the conference that this was an important and fundamental step, an aspect to be considered in the core prohibitions. Of course, it stigmatizes and delegitimizes nuclear weapons in international law and in security doctrines and policies. We already know that Article 4 was the most difficult to negotiate, and this was the innovative part of the exercise that responded to the mandate by the resolution to build provision towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Therefore, it contains provisions that respond to this aspiration for both the countries that conclude their elimination process before joining, and then for the countries that wish to join and then destroy, and establishes the norms and the obligations for that group of countries they will have to comply with to be considered to be in compliance with the treaty provisions. It was precisely because of this challenge of the short time of the negotiations that many aspects were left for the meeting of states parties to further define, which include the possibility to develop instruments or protocols and measures for the verified, time-bound, and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapon programs, including the additional protocols to the treaty, and to continue making decisions on the development of the regime, such as the definition of the Secretariat or the treaty bodies to help with implementation and the identification or creation of the international competent authority. Of course, we know that there is also innovation in the provisions dealing with victim assistance provisions and that are consistent with international human rights law, and the provisions on international cooperation and assistance to assist state parties affected, not only in terms of victims, but also in terms of environmental remediation. The treaty, of course, provides a guidance and a basis for the political discourse and policies of an important part of the international community that adopted and will sign the treaty. And that, of course, challenges the nuclear orthodox. It additionally links this provision norm to other bodies of law dealing with other relevant issues of the international community, such as the environmental law, human rights law, international humanitarian law, among others, and of course creates an important and very much hoped impact on the set of norms, rules, policies, and discourse that shape the way the international community addresses nuclear weapons, with its recognition that any use of nuclear weapons would be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, in particular the principles and rules of international humanitarian law. Of course, acknowledging the ethical imperatives of nuclear disarmament and the urgency of achieving and maintaining a nuclear weapon-free world, which is a global public good of the highest order, that serves both the national and collective security interest, and recognizing that any use of nuclear weapons would be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience, creates yet another standard for the public discourse of the countries that are party and will bring a new reality in the international politics of disarmament. As formulated by former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, it is nuclear disarmament, not nuclear deterrence, that constitutes global public good, and it was an aspect that was mentioned and brought to the table of the negotiations. Needless to say how important it is for many of the countries that participate in the negotiation that the treaty is grounded and is based on the institutional, legal, and political structure of the United Nations and its legitimacy. And as the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs has pointed out, as the UN remains the most appropriate venue for the cause of nuclear disarmament, it is important that the treaty also builds on the existing architecture of the Secretary General. And by virtue of its universal membership, its primary responsibility for peace and security, and its role in upholding the principles of humanity, the UN is the forum in which we should focus the process of negotiating further development of the disarmament regime. As to the future steps, as we all know, we are in this transition process of signing and later ratification of the instrument. But it is very important that we already have a state that has offered to host the first meeting of state parties after the 50th ratification is achieved, which allows the state parties or the signing parties to start identifying and working on the content of the overall concept of putting the treaty in the path of the implementation and universalization in the future, and in seeing how this new development, this new kid on the block, is going to interact with the rest of the existing architecture and the current international geopolitical structure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I know that everyone was certainly eager to hear from you, your views and how you put all these elements together to form the treaty. We are very grateful to you and to the great job that you did. Thank you very much. I would respectfully remind the speakers that we started already behind schedule, so I would ask, please, all of you to try to be as concise as possible. Next speaker is Madame Christine Muttonen, who is the President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. You have the floor, Madame.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Remember the headlines in the press only a few days ago, when you could read, "Will the war of words go nuclear? The war of words leads to nuclear war. The war of words raises prospects of nuclear arms race." And this morning, Mr. Tokayev already said, we are in a dangerous situation. Ladies and gentlemen, as we see, this conference is urgently needed, and my thanks go to all those who made it possible, especially to Kazakhstan, hosting it, and to all of you being here. As you may know, I'm not only the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which is an assembly consisting of parliamentarians from 56 states, but I'm also co-president of parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. So needless to say, this issue is near and dear to my heart, figuratively, but also literally. I come from Carinthia, a lovely part of Austria, in the south of Austria, bordering Italy. Only 2 hours, and you are at the blue and sunny Italian shores of the Adriatic Sea. At the same distance, there is Aviano, the nuclear-outfitted NATO base, air base. In case of an attack on Aviano, or another so-called unforeseen event, my home region would suffer the severe fallout and become uninhabitable. A nuclear bomb does not care for borders, and radioactivity does not care for political or military neutrality. It does not discriminate, which means in the end, it threatens us all. I therefore welcome the important step that 122 countries took in the first week of July when they voted in New York for the historic treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This way declaring that the question of nuclear disarmament is not a topic exclusively belonging to nuclear powers, but that we all should have a word in it. On our annual session this year, which is usually a very big conference in Minsk, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly adopted a resolution in which we welcome the efforts to establish an international ban against the possession, acquisition, or deployment of nuclear weapons. And we urge all OSCE countries to pursue disarmament in good faith. This might come as a surprise, as many of our members come from nuclear weapon states or from states that are under the nuclear protection shield. But in fact, this resolution was only the latest in a long line of recommendations issued by the Parliamentary Assembly on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Over the past 15 years, the Parliamentary Assembly has addressed matters related to nuclear weapons dozens of times in our declarations and resolutions. While the OSCE has historically been more involved in efforts to control and reduce conventional arms and armed forces, the issue of nuclear disarmament is clearly and with no doubt a matter of deepest concern for our organization and for our people, as of course both issues are closely connected with each other. You cannot have a common security system for the huge OSCE era, we always say from Vladivostok to Vancouver. You cannot have such a common security system built on trust and cooperation, and at the same time threaten each other with nuclear annihilation. While nuclear detente was characterized by historic efforts at arms control, we sadly see today the return of nuclear deterrence and breakdowns in nuclear weapons reduction agreements. We see disconnect between what most of the world wants and the policies that a handful of nuclear powers are pursuing. 122 countries have issued a clear call that it is now time to get serious about disarmament. The nuclear powers, however, continue to brandish these weapons and include them in their national security strategies. Several nuclear weapon states will not even agree to pledge a no first use policy. We therefore must continue to send a clear message. We do not accept the use of these weapons with their potentially catastrophic humanitarian consequences. And we do not accept even their existence. Why, after all? If something can never be used because it is too dangerous, why should it exist in the first place? So what can we do to get our message through and to increase the pressure on the nuclear weapon states and their supporters? As a parliamentarian and a leader on nuclear non-proliferation disarmament, I can tell you that there are many things that parliamentarians can do to support these efforts. First of all, we can help to boost the signing and swift ratification of the nuclear ban treaty. This should be one of our most urgent tasks at the moment. Although the nuclear weapon states have regrettably abstained, this treaty is vitally important as a strong international norm against nuclear weapons and the legal framework for their prohibition. We must also continue to press for the implementation of the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. There are still some states that haven't signed and ratified it. We as parliamentarians need to lobby and to convince our governments to do so that it may finally enter into force. Parliamentarians can also encourage the national governments to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their strategic postures and to adopt unambiguous no first use policies. And we can advocate for the irreversible reduction of stockpiles. This year, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Almaty Declaration, which laid the foundation for the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. We can cooperate with governments to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and to revive the idea to create further nuclear weapons-free zones, like in the Middle East. Also by looking for fresh ideas to reach this goal. Heinz Gärtner, a professor on political science, suggested in his recent article just a few days ago in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to make the nuclear weapon states promise to not use nuclear weapons against states with no such weapons, even if they are allies of nuclear weapon states. He calls it negative security assurances, the opposite to extended deterrence. Allow me to quote from his article. He writes, "Put simply, extended deterrence is the promise to use nuclear weapons, while negative security assurances are the promises by nuclear states to not use nuclear weapons," which is the end of the quotation. Ladies and gentlemen, this could be one further step towards extended nuclear weapon-free zones. A compromise, surely a compromise, but one which could be acceptable even for nuclear weapon states. And as we heard today, fewer weapons and fewer possibilities of attack are better. And for all that, we urgently need the support of civil society, because civil society can also produce pressure on our governments, as we saw with the humanitarian pledge, thinking about the humanitarian catastrophe after a nuclear fallout. And of course, we need the youth. This was something mentioned today. And we need dialogue. And dialogue, this was a word which was very often used this morning. The OSCE Parliamentary Assembly provides a forum, and it provides platforms for dialogue and confidence building. You just have to imagine we are over 300 parliamentarians from those 56 states coming together. And it's not easy, and we have different opinions, but we come together and we discuss. And this is the dialogue we need on all levels. We will continue to build bridges across the OSCE region and work for a future of peace and prosperity, a future that hopefully does not include nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madame Muttonen, for this interesting speech on the role and responsibility of parliaments. I'm sure that everyone appreciated that. Next speaker is Ambassador Carlo Trezza from Italy, who was for many years the representative of his country at the CD, and then later was the Italian ambassador for disarmament and non-proliferation. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you to Pugwash and to the Kazakh organizers of this conference, which starts, I would say, on the right footing, and I'm sure we'll also conclude on the right footing. I shall try to stick to the subject of the ban treaty, which was addressed by the two previous speakers. And I would like to start by congratulating Elaine Whyte Gómez for achieving what seemed as a mission impossible, and that is to finalize a treaty on nuclear ban, which is an objective which has been missed for the last, at least for the last 20 years. Indeed, congratulations, and thank you for sharing with us also the secrets of her negotiating technique, because in spite of the fact that she had not really been participating since the beginning to the process, she really put it at a positive and happy end. But when I say happy end, I mean, I'm not sure that we can really say that this is the end of the way towards nuclear disarmament, and therefore looking to the future is also a must for us, and I hope we can always count on you also for this new phase. Anyway, indeed, it was a positive conclusion of an important negotiation and a major positive event on the international scene. It broke the intolerable standstill which had been going on so for decades, and in 3 weeks, indeed, to finalize all this was really something almost of a miracle. I would like to underline one aspect which I think is important, and that is that the treaty legitimized the whole process which had started, I would say, in 2010 after the NPT review conference, the process to really promote the humanitarian dimension of the nuclear weapons and the catastrophic consequences, the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. It also established a proof that nuclear disarmament is feasible, and the hope that nuclear disarmament will be achieved. Therefore, I am quite convinced that the treaty will enter into force, and I'm also convinced that it would be a mistake to try and oppose its entry into force. This morning, while speaking on the CTBT, the question was posed whether the CTBT could be considered as belonging to customary law, universally applicable to countries. Well, the same question was posed also for this treaty, for the ban treaty. I personally think that it is premature to draw this conclusion. The ink of the treaty is still fresh, and it takes some time to reach such a conclusion. Moreover, the treaty was not unanimously adopted. There was one vote against and one abstention. But maybe more importantly, or less importantly, I don't know, I don't want to judge it, there were about 30 countries which did not participate at all in these negotiations, and I think that this was a mistake. I think it was a mistake because, first of all, there is an obligation enshrined in Article 6 of the NPT, obligation to negotiate nuclear disarmament. And this obligation was confirmed by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and it was this fact of the fact that negotiating nuclear disarmament is an obligation was adopted unanimously by the International Court of Justice. So, indeed, all countries should have participated in this negotiation, even if they were not in agreement with all its features, but they could have at least make clear what their views are on this question. And there was also a question of respect of the majority of the international community, which with 130 countries had voted in favor of this negotiation. Another shortcoming that I see was that in many countries there was no debate on this treaty. And therefore the position not to participate or sometimes in one case to vote against was taken without a serious debate. I think that on the contrary, there were some cases, like in Japan, where the decision was taken through a very excruciating debate. And indeed, a debate would have been really necessary. I think it is not too late to have this debate, even if the treaty has already been finalized, because it really deserved a lot of, I would say, a lot of discussion. I have some concerns with the treaty, and the main one is its coherence with the NPT, because there are some provisions of the ban treaty which are indeed a departure from what is the acquis of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I refer in particular to the distinctions between nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapon states. This distinction is no longer there in the ban treaty. And therefore, for the countries which will ratify this treaty, nuclear weapon states will be outlaws, and this is a major departure from the NPT. Also, the question of stationing of nuclear weapons, which is tolerated by the NPT, is no longer tolerated by the ban treaty. And this would create problems. Also, CTBT. CTBT is not yet entered into force, but for the countries having ratified the ban treaty, the CTBT provisions, non-testing, would be legally binding. And therefore, it creates two different categories of states. So all this will, I think, create some difficulties. It will create some difficulties in particular in the European Union, the area from which I come. Indeed, I think never before has Europe been so divided on nuclear issues than in this case. If you think that there were some countries like Austria and Ireland which were among the promoters and the sponsors of the initiative of one hand, and then we had nuclear weapon states like the UK and France which were definitely against this treaty. NATO countries did not vote the resolution. EU NATO countries did not vote the resolutions, and most of them did not participate in the negotiation. But there are not only NATO countries in Europe, and there are some countries which have, let's say, a neutralistic background, which were in favor of the convention. So really one of the main tasks in the future for the EU is to try and reconstruct a difficult cohesion on the question of nuclear weapons, and it's not going to be easy. A parallel has been made with the process of Ottawa and Oslo to ban landmines and cluster munitions, because the negotiation took place among countries which are like-minded, no? The countries which were against did not participate. Well, there is a difference, however, that in the Ottawa and Oslo conventions, the countries possessing landmines and cluster munitions were participating, whereas in New York, all the possessors of nuclear weapons were not there. So in this there is a difference. Anyway, the conclusion that I draw is that, and this was already said, that clearly the treaty is indeed a milestone on the path of nuclear disarmament, but it cannot be the final word, and therefore there's a lot of work ahead for all of us, and we have to maintain our engagement in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your considerations on the pros and cons, the short backs, and the conquests of the treaty and the difficulties that we have before us. But I'm sure we're going to negotiate and win those problems too. I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Bruce Blair from the Program of Science and Global Security at the Princeton University. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Sergio. And I appreciate the invitation to come here and comment on this session's topic of the ban treaty and the elimination of nuclear weapons. When you look at the ban treaty, I'm curious whether you see a glass half full or half empty. And I won't poll the audience, but I would just say, for myself, I admit to being ambivalent and torn about it. As a speaker on the risk of the use of nuclear weapons at the Humanitarian Consequences conferences in Mexico and Vienna, I'm clearly someone who's very sympathetic to the treaty, and I have a foot very much firmly planted in that camp. As a co-founder of Global Zero, whose action plan takes a quite different approach to the elimination of nuclear weapons, I have a foot very much outside the camp of the ban treaty. So I'm operating in a realm right now of uncertainty and hope more than anything else. I do hope the treaty helps reduce the grave and growing nuclear risks to humanity that exist today, and I believe that it will. And I hope that it advances the cause of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and I believe it will do that as well. I believe it'll help on both scores, but only if it doesn't weaken the NPT, which I regard as a linchpin in the disarmament and non-pro effort. And in this connection, I associate myself almost completely with the reservations expressed by Ambassador Trezza, particularly the one about the loss of distinction in the ban treaty between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, and the implications of that for the condemnation of the weapon states. I do believe that this treaty will strengthen the norm against use and possession. It'll do that by underscoring the catastrophic consequences of any use, and also by putting political and possibly legal pressure on the nuclear weapon states to do a lot more to fulfill Article 6. But at the same time, there's a real risk here, I think, that the treaty will undercut the NPT. I also associate myself with the Swedish statement explaining its vote in favor of the treaty. Sweden warned us that some delegations involved in the negotiation do not view the NPT as all that essential. And these states are apparently wittingly out to undermine the NPT, to break the current system in favor of a ban-oriented approach. I think we may see this battle joined at the NPT RevCon, where some may well push the ban as the new vehicle for advancing disarmament and non-proliferation. We'll see. But there are signs that this may happen. And it's a maneuver that may well draw support from many of you right here. And I'm very curious to hear your views of this. And that includes the Pugwash Council, whose members appear to regard providing a legal prohibition against nuclear weapons as a much higher priority than saving the NPT. That's my reading. Please dispute that if it's not correct. In any case, I believe that such a change in direction would be a huge, huge mistake, because for all of its faults and its frustrations, the NPT is and always will be much more inclusive than the ban treaty, and its all-important safeguards with widening adoption of the additional protocol are much higher than the bans. Now, in reality, you know, face it here, the nuclear weapon states are never going to join this particular ban treaty. Even if there were some or a subset or all of the nuclear weapons nations ready to enter into a disarmament agreement, this treaty would not offer them a practical vehicle. They need a real treaty with details, with definitions, with verification and enforcement mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. The ban treaty falls woefully short of providing effective mechanisms for dispute resolution, and is just wide open for conflicting interpretations of obligations. I mentioned in this morning's session the question about the ban treaty's prohibition on testing, and the fact that no one really knows what that means at this point. So, you know, the hard work to determine how the elimination of 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world can be achieved both physically and from a security perspective, that hard work remains to be done. A practical treaty, in my view, will have to allow the parties something on the order of 10 years at least to verifiably declare, dismantle, and destroy existing weapons and materials. None of the nuclear weapon states have ever transparently destroyed even a single weapon in the past. This is new territory. A practical treaty will most likely envision phased, verified, and proportional reductions over a period of time, much longer than that envisioned by the ban treaty. And individual states will probably stop short of completely eliminating their arsenals on this negotiated path unless and until their nuclear adversaries have come on board and are participating fully and reciprocally. And during this lengthy drawdown, the parties will insist, and again, this is at odds with the spirit and the statement of the ban treaty, they will insist on the right of self-defense under the UN Charter, and that right allows them to threaten the use of nukes to deter and to actually use them if attacked by nuclear weapons. And they'll require that the non-nuclear weapon states adopt the additional protocol. There are other points here, other practical considerations that I think are clearly very much at odds with the ban treaty. And there's one other practical obstacle prior to any of this that I just described unfolding on a multilateral treaty basis, and that's that the US and Russia are going to have to make very, very deep reductions in their arsenals, probably down to 1,000 total on each side to set the stage. All of this sounds a lot like a step-by-step approach, and it is. And the Global Zero Action Plan looks a lot like this as well, because step-by-step is inevitable in any process of elimination, and in fact, it's the clearest and fastest way forward right now. So I'm going to wrap up and by saying that we all need to get back to work pressuring the US and Russia to resolve their verification issues and to extend the New START as soon as possible and to restart arms reduction negotiations. We need to focus our energy that is currently diffuse and spread thin. That energy needs to be focused on pushing the United States, Russia, and others hard to take urgent steps like de-alerting and no first use to protect humanity from a nuclear disaster today. And then we need to push all of the nuclear weapon states into a process, into a multilateral dialogue that could morph into a real negotiation for the elimination of weapons. So I sort of don my devil's advocate hat here. I hope that's okay. No one wants to hear just a cheerleader. But I would just say that the ban treaty is definitely a positive. I'm at some level a real fan. But it's no substitute for a lot of very hard treaty building work ahead to eliminate nuclear weapons. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these very clear ideas on the difficulties and the obstacles that are in the path, but also thank you also for your faith in the final outcome of nuclear disarmament. We have, of course, advanced into the time that was devoted to questions and to the break, which was supposed to start at 15:15, which is exactly the time now, and end in 15 minutes. We still have one speaker. And the speaker is from Kazakhstan, which is very important for us to note and to listen to him. He's Mr. Alimzhan Akhmetov from the Center for National Security and Policy in Astana. If we have some spare minutes at the end of Mr. Akhmetov's presentation, then I would like to open the floor for questions. But then let's see how it unfolds, how much time we will have in the end. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's difficult to make last statement since we are out of the schedule, but I will shorten my delivery. First of all, I would like to thank Pugwash movement and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting the center to this conference. As an NGO which participated in both sessions of the conference negotiating the new treaty, we are not completely satisfied with the new treaty, and actually Mr. Blair mentioned some key points, and I will not mention them again. There are a lot of discussions about the interface between new treaty and the existing NPT. For example, nuclear weapon states' position is clear. For example, Russian Federation in May this year in Vienna during the preparatory committee of the review conference NPT stated that they called all to remember that about the responsibility for the NPT and not to prejudice the NPT. But we believe that this new treaty is aimed to strengthen and develop the Article 6 of NPT. So, and the discussion what is stronger or what upper and what is the order of two treaties is not correct in our view. About the negotiation process and the two sessions, unfortunately, the participating states were not like a single space. And regarding again back to the NPT, for example, Switzerland, Sweden, Singapore, Austria, and Netherlands actively promoted the thesis to the Article 18, and their suggestion was to exclude last 8 words. And if it would happen, then the new treaty would be subordinate to the NPT. But fortunately, it is not. We also would like to mention that about the preamble of the treaty, that the preamble of the treaty does not have the following provisions. First is the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of July 8, 1996. The next is a final document of the 10th Special Session of the General Assembly of June 1978. And the conference is held on humanitarian impact of the nuclear weapons. And the last but not the least, of course, conventions on the prohibition of biological and chemical weapons. All these references in the preamble, we believe, could show the road which the passed during these 72 years to this important treaty. About the co-prohibitions, Article 1, we would like to underline that unfortunately the conference could not include in the article following provisions such as prohibitions on military or other preparations for the use of nuclear weapons, financing of research in the field of nuclear weapons, and the most important in our view is transit of nuclear weapons. It is interesting that during the negotiations we were surprised that the conference and the state participants to that negotiations made huge efforts to prohibit the threat of use of nuclear weapons. What about as Mr. Blair mentioned, about the verification of nuclear disarmament? In our view, it is the Achilles heel of this treaty, and I will not repeat your arguments, and you can find our view on in our working paper on the Pugwash website. And in conclusion, nevertheless, we have what we have, and we consider this treaty is the historical milestone on the road of nuclear disarmament. And we are sure and we believe that this new treaty will pressure the nuclear weapon states and their allies to work on the process of nuclear disarmament. And finally, let me suggest if this conference will have the final document, let me suggest to not mention, but underline this new treaty in the final document of this conference. But what is the most important is we urge this conference to call to nuclear weapon states and their allies in the final document to consider to sign and join this treaty. Again, we would like to underline that this treaty is the historical event, and July 7 and September 20 will be the important dates in the history of nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Akhmetov. We have 8 minutes until we finish and enter, of course, encroach into the period of break. I take it that everyone agrees. If I would give a chance for at least 3 questions from the floor, and then we'll see. I see Tariq Rauf first there. We could take 3 questions and then let the panelists respond. Second question there. And another one. I'm sorry. I see many hands. Let's see if we have time. We have 1, 2, and 3 here. Please make your questions. Please make them as short and concise as possible. No microphone. Why don't you come upstairs here?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Tariq Rauf. I'm speaking in my former capacity as Head of Verification and Security Policy Coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Ambassador Elaine for this singular achievement of hers in completing this treaty in record time. Of course, not all treaties are perfect, but I wanted to comment that this treaty has changed the discourse. And the old discourse of having very complicated treaties like the Chemical Weapons Convention and the CTBT with very elaborate verification mechanisms, those days are over. And I think what Ambassador Whyte was trying to achieve is what is called the South Africa Plus model, where each of the weapon states would find ways of disarming and put the nuclear material under international verification, and this worked very well. In the case of South Africa, for 20 years, the Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the UK have had a bilateral program on verification of nuclear warhead dismantlement. And in 20 years, they cannot agree on how to define a nuclear warhead. So if the UK and the US cannot agree, what are the chances of the others agreeing? And therefore, I think the approach suggested in this treaty may not be perfect from the Cold War way of thinking of a very elaborate treaty with definitions, with verification protocols, and so on. That may have been ideal in another time, but now the parties to the NPT, particularly the non-nuclear weapon states, have run out of patience. They tried under Ambassador Dhanapala to agree on steps, principles, and objectives. Then in 2000, there were the 13 practical steps. Then in 2010, we had the plan of action. None of that was implemented, which is one of the reasons why we had the humanitarian conferences in Norway, Mexico, and Austria, and then finally this resolution that led Ambassador Whyte to preside over this conference. So I have two questions for you, Ambassador Whyte. The entry into force calls for 50 states. This is 7 more than the NPT and 6 more than the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So perhaps you could tell us why this number 50 was chosen, and how many states do you expect would show up to sign the treaty on the 20th of September? Thank you.
Let us take the questions, and then we'll have the panelists answer. I had one question from there, from the gentleman over there.
Thank you.
You, sir. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So
Please.
my question is very simple. You see, we are speaking about the correlation of the all disarmament treaties, and how do you see within the frame of the discussion on the prohibition of use of nuclear weapons the effect of the ABM treaty, which the United States has withdrawn and which created the crisis in the whole problem of the disarmament? This is the question to all the panelists.
Thank you. The other question was here. You, sir, yes. Yeah, gentleman with the white hair behind you.
Thank you, Alan Ware.
Yes, Alan, go ahead.
Question from Ambassador Whyte Gómez
you.
and Bruce Blair that could advance both sides of the equation, the comprehensive approach and the step-by-step approach. And that is, Ambassador Whyte Gómez, do you think that there could be achieved the 50 ratifications in time for the 2018 UN High-Level Conference on Nuclear Disarmament in September next year, and whether that would be a good way of encouraging states to ratify quickly and then have the entry into force announced at the 2018 UN High-Level Conference? And to Bruce, what disarmament steps do you think we could push the nuclear weapon states to make progress on for the 2018 High-Level Conference? Might we be able to push them to make steps on no first use, de-alerting, stockpile reductions, and can the 2018 UN High-Level Conference be used as like a media and political push to move the nuclear weapon states on some of these steps? Thank you.
Thank you. These are a very clear questions, so I'll give the floor first to Ambassador Whyte Gómez and then to Blair, who are the targets of the questions. Go ahead.
Thank you. Let me first mention an aspect. I think Tariq was able to somewhat respond to some of the questions and that have been raised about this the instrument. Overall, the most important reflection, and this is the reason why I mentioned at the beginning that every single social reality is composed of many different dimensions with it that interact with each other. And that the mandate that the GA granted the conference with was a very specific and very focused with dealing with the prohibition norm. Of course, it did in such a way it was a little tricky because it said build the prohibition norm in such a way that it leads toward the total elimination. But it was not, the conference was not mandated to negotiate the actual elimination programs or the actual destruction of arsenals. So this, what I'm trying to say is that there are other steps, there are other agendas that are not related to and should not be become hostage to the norm setting process. So it is very important to have this distinction between the norm setting and the actual negotiation and the actual implementation of the disarmament agreements, which is something that the General Assembly very clearly distinguished for different reasons that we already know. The issue of ratifications, of the number of ratifications, was an aspect that was discussed, but it was not a contentious issue. And for some countries, it was important that the number of ratification was a little bit more related to the current membership number of countries that are members to the UN. And that raising the number of ratification, the threshold for the entry into force a little bit, would also increase the force of the agreement once it enters into force. And still, 50 ratifications are not something that will be hard to expect. Overall, and in this I would also respond to the second question in terms of the high standards towards the entry into force and the ratification. It is very interesting that you can see, I mean, if you see the movement and you see the process, the political process of that led to the ban treaty, you see a number of states that are completely committed. That number, although some countries had fear that maybe for the adoption itself, the number could decrease a little bit, that was not the case. It actually solidified the support coalition, to put it that way. We would expect then 120 countries would very soon be able to sign the treaty. It's always good to have high standards. So in general terms, 50 ratifications would make it stronger for the entry into force and would not necessarily imperil the fact that it will enter into force rather sooner than later. And we, of course, have high standards in terms of the signing and later entering into force for the norm.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Bruce, but let's just to thank Ambassador Dana Pala, who is the chair of the next panel, for giving us a few minutes more in our discussions.
So the question on the ABM treaty is indeed a sticky wicket in the prospect of negotiation between the United States and Russia and China too, for that matter. And it's complicated the process and made it extremely difficult to make progress. But it's not the only sticky wicket these days. There's a whole complex of factors now that both Russia, particularly Russia, but also the United States and China, take into account in assessing what direction and how far they can go on nuclear arms reductions. And that, besides ABM, there's also conventional precision-guided munitions, which the United States has an amazing sort of juggernaut, anti-satellite weapons, cyber warfare weapons. There's a whole complex of things that now need to be taken into account, and that is the whole premise underlying the idea of strategic stability talks between the United States and Russia, which President Putin has offered to Donald Trump, who's rebuffed it so far. So yeah, it's really complicated, and it's a real obstacle to surmount. As far as the sticks are concerned, I think no first use is the transformational change in thinking, in policy, in doctrine, in operations, in command and control, et cetera, that would really put the nuclear weapons countries on track to get a handle on where they could go with nuclear arms reductions. Because essentially it eviscerates a credible adoption of no first use. And as you know, a number of nuclear weapons countries have already adopted this policy. This eviscerates the rationale for nuclear warfighting, no first use, because it basically relegates the role of nuclear weapons to second use. The sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter their use by other countries. President Obama was that close to adopting that in the penultimate draft of his nuclear posture review in 2010, and he was talked out of it at the last minute by a staffer in the National Security Council, who I won't name, but so the United States is close to it, and it's, as I say, it could be transformational, and it would not be that hard to swallow. And finally, just a comment on Tariq. I think, you know, South Africa's disarming is by no stretch of the imagination close to the process that would have to be undertaken if if the nuclear weapons countries decide to disarm nuclear warheads. We've never agreed to disarm nuclear warheads ever with anybody. And so naturally there's been no deep work on defining what a nuclear warhead is, et cetera, but there would be if the dismantling of nuclear warheads was a central part of an elimination treaty process. You can be sure that the warheads would be characterized in a way that would facilitate practical disarmament, and it's also, everyone's got to agree to that because it's got to be a multilateral process. South Africa was a unilateral disarmament exercise. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about 9 nuclear weapons countries, and they're all going to have to kind of go through a process of consensus on definitions and on elimination processes. And nuclear warheads are going to, you can't just sweep that under some sort of abstract idea of, that warheads are warheads, and let's not bother to try to figure out what they actually are. It's not going to fly, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much. I think that as much as we would like to continue this discussion because of the competence and expertise of our panelists and also the interest of all of us on this question, unfortunately, we have a time limit to take care of. Thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists for their brilliant exposure. Very good.